Welcome to episode 31 of FTCE Seminar, a teacher certification podcast. I'm your host, Mercedes Musto. In today's episode, I'll be talking about the FTCE General Knowledge Reading Subtest. This is part 10 of a multi-series review of what you need to know to pass the reading section of the GK. Today, we're going to talk about evaluating content presented in different formats. What? When you say content, do you mean information? And when you say different formats, are you talking about like pictures and graphs, websites, stuff like that? Well, yes and no. Yes, because pictures, graphs, and websites are sources of information. And what we'll be learning today is the difference between primary and secondary sources of information. So let's get started. Concept 1, primary and secondary sources. Let's take a look at some definitions and examples here. A primary source. Definition: original content or first-hand account that provides evidence during the time that the source represents. Things like original documents, creative works, artifacts, or relics are primary sources. A few specific examples include scientific research article, data, an autobiography, historical documents, a diary, letters, poetry, paintings, interviews of a source, and speeches. Yeah, speeches. Now, secondary sources are a bit different, so let's define those. Secondary source. Definition: an interpretation of a primary source, which is one or two steps away from the original source itself. This interpretation could be an analysis, a summary, a critique, or an editorial. The idea here is that the secondary source is about one or more primary sources. Specific examples of secondary sources include biographies, editorials, commentaries, reviews, and articles referencing someone else's research. The common ground here is that a biography is about someone else's life. An editorial or commentary may be about someone else's work or a historical event. A review or article could be written about someone else's poetry. Regardless of the type of secondary source is being used, secondary sources are not original documents, creative works, or artifacts. Pop quiz. Are the following examples primary or secondary sources? Here's a quick tip. Remember that primary sources can be original documents, creative works, artifacts, and relics. Number 1. A biography about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Primary or secondary source? Secondary, because it's a biography. Someone else is writing about Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Number 2. Poetry by Khalil Gibran. Primary or secondary? Primary, because it's original works. Number 3. A website about ancient artifacts of the world. Primary or secondary? Secondary. Although this one said the word artifact and artifacts are primary sources, this is a website about primary sources. Therefore, it's one or two steps away, so it's secondary. Number 4, a painting titled Water Lilies by Monet. Primary or secondary? Primary. Again, this is an original work. Number 5, a review of the literature on educational technology. Primary or secondary? Secondary. Why? Because it's reviewing and analyzing other people's original research. Well, there we have it, primary and secondary resources. Let's review. When you're evaluating content presented in different formats, you are first noticing if it's a website, an artifact, a speech, or exactly what form the content is in. Then you will identify if the content is a primary or secondary source. Remember that primary sources are original content or a first-hand account that provides evidence during the time the source represents. Things like documents, creative works, and artifacts. And a secondary source, these are interpretations of primary sources, which is one or two steps away from the original source itself. Things like reviews, critiques, and editorials are all secondary sources. Your knowledge of primary and secondary sources will help you evaluate content presented in different formats on the reading portion of the general knowledge test. You know, I'm really proud of you. You've been studying so hard. For more practice with reading strategies, visit FTCE Seminar to study for the test. The important thing is to start studying today so you can pass the teacher certification exam. Well, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts and start studying today. This podcast was recorded at Pickens Multimedia Studio at the University of West Florida. This podcast is listener supported. Contributions can be made via the listener support link on Spotify. This is your host, Mercedes Musto. Join us again on FTCE Seminar, a teacher certification podcast so you can pass the FTCE.